We see this in the natural world. When a tree is ill and dies, it is often cut down so that the plants and wildlife around it can flourish in new ways. We've seen this in our own memorial garden. The tree that once filled most of this window is now gone. The landscape looks different and things are growing in new ways. The plants that once knew the shade of the tree's limbs now receive more direct sunlight. We might imagine some initial discomfort with those bright rays, much as the more direct sunlight that now greets our own faces, particularly at the early service on Sunday mornings, right in this direction, when we're sitting in those pews that were also once shaded by the tree's limbs. The shade from the tree was comforting and even protective. But still, the plants adjust to more sunlight and grow in new ways and bring beauty to the space of this window in ways that we could not imagine before we locked the tree. And before we leave this image of the garden, I think it bears naming that in the Passion Gospel that we've just heard, we both begin and end in a garden. Jesus is arrested in the garden, and then his body is laid in a new tomb in the garden. I think we should hold that close. So death changes and disrupts the environment which has known its presence. We know this in our own lives as well. When we lose a loved one, our identity, our relationships, our sense of belonging shift in profound ways. When we lose a parent, what does it mean now to be a daughter? When we lose a spouse, what does it mean now to be a partner? When we lose a sibling, what does it mean now to be a sibling? And what does it mean to be the child of parents who have now lost a child? When we lose a close friend, what does it look like now to seek companionship in the world? And then there are the other deaths, too. The loss of a marriage, the loss of a job, the loss of some physical ability. All of these and more also change and disrupt our identity, relationships, and sense of belonging. Like the plants in the memorial garden, there are opportunities in the wake of these deaths to greet the sun in new ways and grow in ways not imagined. But that's more challenging for our human selves. It's more difficult in the dance of body, mind, and soul. And even more difficult when the experience of death is violent and traumatic. And that brings us to the cross. When we lose our Savior, the Christ, when God incarnate is hanging on a cross outside of town, what does it mean now to be a follower of Jesus? Who are we as people of faith? How do we relate to one another? Do we have a place in a world where violence is celebrated and seems to win on so many days, especially this day? Even as Jesus hangs on the cross, a victim of political and religious systems terrified of being disrupted, Jesus holds all of these questions. Who are we now? How do we relate to one another? Do we belong? He gathers these questions to himself. He folds them into the word of who he is. Because remember, in the Gospel of John, it begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. Jesus is that word. So in this moment at the cross, Jesus folds these questions, the words of these questions, into the word of who he is, and then Jesus speaks a word. He sees those who have remained near to him, even unto this moment. The closest witnesses of his violent and traumatic death. His mother, Mary. His mother's sister, also Mary. Mary Magdalene, and the disciple whom he loved. And we're not exactly sure who this disciple is, and it also doesn't really matter. Jesus sees these four. He especially sees his mother and the beloved disciple. And having gathered all of those questions into himself, he speaks a word. Woman, he says, here is your son. And to the beloved disciple, here is your mother. Other translations say, behold your mother and behold your son. Behold is a heavier word. It communicates perhaps something like what we heard last night in the upper room. I give you a new commandment. Behold. Behold your son. Behold your mother. In this moment, with Jesus' word spoken, Mary and the beloved disciple are no longer also victims of the trauma of the cross, not at least in the way that it was intended. Behold. With these words from Jesus, their identity is not shattered. They are not left without community and without relationships. At the foot of the cross, Jesus tells them that they belong to one another. And it's an intimate moment, not unlike perhaps some other experiences of death that we've experienced. People concerned about the care of their loved ones. How will things continue in their absence? So this intimate moment for Jesus and his mother and the disciple, Mary now knows that she will be cared for in a society that demands she have a husband or a son to care for her. And the beloved disciple now knows that he will know the love of a mother who follows and stays with her child all the way to a traumatic death. They know they belong to one another. So from the cross, Jesus has already disrupted the designs of the power systems that have killed him. The disruption is for his mother and for the beloved disciple, but it's also for all of us. From the cross, Jesus says, I give you this new commandment. Behold, at the foot of the cross, my followers become one. As my physical body is weak, my followers now become my body. Children and parents to one another, siblings and companions, God's love alive and active in the world. Jesus' presence every time corrupt systems of power seek to kill and destroy. Death changes and disrupts the environment which has known its presence. And this Friday is good because the disruption of this death is not what it seems. Jesus frustrates the powers and forces that have crucified him, even as he still hangs on their instrument of death and defeat. Behold your son. Behold your mother. A new word has been spoken. The new creation has begun. Be not far away, O Lord, because your family, Christ's body, is waiting for your next word.